Hi, I'm Marie Rivas, Senior Software Engineer at data.world. The conversation around data mesh has shifted from what is it to how do I actually do it? That's what we're going to talk about right now. Join me in welcoming our panelists, Barr Moses of Monte Carlo, Gary George of Indeed, Paul Gancz of Snowflake, and Jon Loyens and Patrick McGarry of data.world as they dive into the duality of the data mesh.
Perfect. Thank you, Marie. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our data mesh panel, where hopefully we can attempt to separate the buzz from the beef. So I'm Patrick McGarry, as Marie mentioned. I'm head of strategic partnerships here at data.world, and I will play your host today. But today we're going to look for the real experts. So data mesh is an aggregation of several different concepts in the industry, from data as a product, where we're putting sort of the most well-versed on the data in charge of its dispersal, agile methodologies, domain-driven architecture, and several others. But thankfully, I'm joined by four experts in the data ecosystem who are heavily versed in these concepts and can really help to shed some of the light on why data mesh matters and how it's transforming the industry. I know we do have limited time, though, so I'm going to jump right into it because it's a really broad subject, and I want to give the panelists the opportunity to display their expertise. So we'll start with the first one. So, as the original architect of the term data mesh, Zhamak Dehghani defined it roughly, I'll paraphrase here, as sort of a type of data platform architecture that embraces the ubiquity of data in the enterprise by leveraging things like I mentioned, the domain-oriented self-serve design. However, what I'm looking for, more practically speaking, is what does data mesh mean to you, both from a personal point of view and your expertise, but also how it's likely to transform the industry. So, Barr, I guess we'll start with you as the CEO and co-founder of Monte Carlo in the data observability space. What are your thoughts on data mesh?
Yeah, for sure. And I like that you started with asking sort of separating the buzz from the beef. I think this is one of the topics where there's a lot of buzz and it's hard to sort of parse out the beef. So I'm excited for this panel to help sort of shed light on this. Maybe just kind of set the backdrop for why I think data mesh has sort of risen to sort of the top of the conversation now. I think there's been a big shift in data in general in the last few years. We're seeing a lot more people actually working with data. If before sort of the work of data is really confined to a handful of people in the organization. Today, you have sort of really large teams, different titles, so data engineers, data analysts, data scientists, machine learning engineers, analytics engineers, data product managers. That's just five that I mentioned sort of off the cuff. There's so many people that are working with data. And so the question of ownership and responsibility and governance has become a lot harder. There's obviously a lot more data to handle. We've talked a lot about that. There's also sort of some standardization around technology in a sense. So companies like Databricks and Snowflake and BigQuery and many other sort of technologies are doing extremely well, right? Snowflake at $1 billion in revenue, Databricks with 800 million and accelerating. So really sort of the prevalence of the ability to sort of store and process and aggregate data has become a lot easier in the last few years. And so with sort of kind of all these changes as the backdrop, the question is, how do data teams actually make data actionable and insightful and something that folks can actually use in their companies? And people have struggled with that. It's actually really hard. It's hard to get buy-in for it. It's hard to structure your team in a way that actually sort of allows to make use of data. And the common pitfalls for folks are data as a silo, so data teams don't actually have a seat at the table. There's a lot of data that's being aggregated but not being used at all. Or the data team is sort of a bottleneck where people kind of sort of see it as a cost center, where folks can kind of ask questions of data teams, but it might take sort of months or years until you can actually get the data that you need. So those are all the challenges that sort of come as a result of those changes. And I think the data mesh in particular, sort of the ideas of the data mesh really originate or sort of relies on, to your point, concepts from software engineering that we're sort of adopting into the space of data. And just like sort of the move from monolithic to microservices in software engineering, we're introducing some of those changes in data in particular. So we're taking concepts, just to use like a very kind of specific concept, of actually introducing contracts between teams. So we talked about a lot of different teams working together to solve data problems. What if there was a very clear defined contract for data between a data analytics and a data engineering team? I think the data mesh sort of brings those sort of together, introducing new ways for teams to work together to actually make data actionable and insightful. So that's what it means to me. It's actually sort of a natural evolution of the last few years where it's become a lot harder to do things with data, a lot harder to truly become data-driven as a company. And the concepts that the data mesh introduces actually allows us to move forward towards actually making sense of the data that we have and taking action based on it.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I like the call out to moving data as a cost center to actually operationalizing it. And Gary, I'll go to you next. Your title's a mouthful, the Senior Technical Product Manager for Data Ecosystem Platform. But I know Indeed has done a lot of work in that space in particular of taking data from a cost center to operationalizing it for people to consume and do meaningful things with. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of where you're coming from on data mesh.
Yeah, I think it echoes a lot of what Barr is talking about. I mean, for me, just really simply is how do we connect data producers to data consumers and look at that relationship? One thing that Barr mentioned is there's been a lot of middlemen in the way of that. So people helping to build the pipelines, helping to build the platforms, helping to set standards. And I think there's a realization the more we can get to the people that are extremely knowledgeable of how the data comes to exist, and connect to those with the people that are using it, they develop some of those product skills, like the deep empathy for how people are using their data and how to support them. So I think there's, at many companies, including Indeed, you'll see just organic examples where teams have kind of figured this out naturally, but how do you set this a pattern and make your enterprise adopt it? And I think that's kind of my summation of data mesh. Data mesh is providing a lot of tools and methods to help do this. And then the last thing I'll say is maybe the promise of this is, can we have high data quality? Can we have exciting data capabilities? Can we do it with high velocity? And can we do it at some of these enterprise scales? I mean, I think if you can bring those together through the data mesh principles or whatever other tools you have, then you're really starting to get the value out of the data you have.
Excellent. Yeah. And, Paul, I guess I'll go to you next. As a partner solutions architect at Snowflake, I guess you're playing the part of the heavy today, right? Like, Snowflake is the industry giant now, and you have a really interesting point of view where you get to see not just Snowflake's point of view, but all of the folks that Snowflake works with. So I'd really love to hear sort of how that's coming together, especially around the concept of data mesh.
Yeah, it's great. And thanks, Patrick. And, with the move to the cloud, we're just seeing those data silos really, the issue of data silos and how do you get all of that data up to the cloud, make it available as quickly as possible for the end users, make it easily discoverable, make it governed. That's the challenge that organizations have been having. And what data mesh does is it allows those organizations to make sense of the data, to properly govern it, and ultimately just make it available as soon as possible to their end users with a contract that makes sense for them. For us, it's our partnerships around data catalog and data observability and quality, and making sure that data is trusted, easily discoverable, built in ways that the businesses understand is really key.
Excellent. Yeah. And, it's a good point too with the users and kind of the way that we interact. That's kind of been a theme throughout all of yours. And Jon, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about the user and what data mesh is going to mean from a practical standpoint. You want to share a little bit about sort of the data.world POV on the data mesh?
Yeah, absolutely. At data.world, we worked for years to really think hard and to try to enact a little bit of change around making data analytics a team sport. I loved what Barr said about data analytics becoming more of a team. It's not just a lone wolf data scientist or a BI person buried in some department trying to come up with great data-driven insights for your organization. it is a lot more about getting your whole organization involved at this point. And much like I think a lot about the historical context of this. I also love the angle and bent that Zhamak has around data mesh about being a socio-technical architecture, that it has both social, people, and prospect aspects and technology aspects. Like, we have to support and think about new technologies to support this style of working across the organization that's going to really engender a wider variety of stakeholders to participate in the data analytics process. I think a lot about the history of software engineering and the different software engineering movements that we've gone through to get to the point where we can now deliver really useful software products across the enterprise. If you think back to the early 2000s, every company had to be a technology company. They hired like armies of software engineers who would sit around being like, what is it that we're actually building? And you see a lot of the same thing happening in data analytics. The great thing about the agile software movement was that it focused small teams operating independently on the actual stakeholders, actually involving the stakeholders, having them learn about the process of delivering software and what it took, putting those producers of the software and the consumers together, a lot like what Gary said about putting data producers and consumers together and having them work in that iterative workflow. But what really helped also that movement, and I think this is also part of the data mesh movement, the technical part of socio-technical, is that we also adopted very common ways of moving and working. So organizations would lean on being Scrum-based or Kanban-based, so that even though you had these small independent teams, they're all working in very similar ways, sharing methods and sharing best practices, a lot of times coordinating through a central project management office, people who could be agile trainers or drive those best practices across. I think we're going to need the same thing for data mesh, because as people move from team to team, they're going to want to be able to apply those skills and those methods of working across the organization. And we need really good processes and governance of how all these stakeholders work together. So I think this idea, this balance between the centralized and the decentralized, is really critical for getting adoption. And then when we get there, we're going to need a new suite of tools to support that kind of teamwork, whether it is great discovery through things like catalogs, mapping all of our different data assets together through knowledge graphs, and building trusted data resources through observability, just to name a few. And there's an explosion of tech out there right now in the modern data stack, trying to support all the different ways we're going to have to think to really adopt the data mesh.
Awesome. Yeah. And I love that you call out the cultural approach and the cultural discipline that's required, especially as the data ecosystem and companies' approach to data continues to evolve. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit. And I think we can loosen it up here. We don't need to call on people. Like, let's, definitely jump in CNN Crossfire style, right? So looking at that cultural approach and sort of the social disciplines and procedures that are required to make the most of sort of a data mesh approach, which I think is bringing together sort of that decentralized and centralized, and hopefully bringing the best of both. But what are the sorts of things culturally that companies are really going to have to focus on evolving as we move into sort of this data mesh architecture? And anybody can feel free to chime in.
I'll start. I think a lot of it starts with redefining how we think about what data governance is and what it can be, right? In the software world, agile processes are very well governed. People know as they jump from team to team with small variations in most, highly skilled organizations, how software gets built, how you involve and include stakeholders. And I think if we shift thinking about how we do governance, for example, to be more of an enabler and thinking about bringing data producers and consumers together and establishing what those best practices are, rather than a like top-down style, waterfall style even way of thinking about it, that's going to be one of those enablers for me in how do we enact that cultural change. So yeah, I think offices of the CDOs, VPs of analytics need to think more about how do we involve groups of stakeholders? How do we build a really inclusive environment and get everybody on the same page, more than, you know, what maybe they've previously thought about as like a compliance and risk mitigation strategy?
Yeah, I guess I'll like jump in and pile on a little bit here. So I'm kind of thinking of you know, I can bucket into three roles. We've got data consumers, we've got data producers, and we've got these data enablers in between. And in that middle piece, I'll put both the data governance teams as well as maybe the data platform teams that exist. And so everything Jon said about that data governance, I think a lot of it applies to these data engineering platforms, where the big goal should be maybe not what they did before and they have to build everything, or they're the experts in data technology, but more in this facilitation role, where how do they bring people together, hear what they have to say, build the self-service platforms that are going to make those other teams successful, and then get out of the way sometimes. And I think data governance needs to facilitate standards and sometimes get out of the way. They need to figure out data domains and work together. And so there's a lot of these roles that were really kind of, I would almost call gatekeepers to the old data methodologies and pipelines. And now they're facilitators. They're empowering the whole organization to be successful with data.
Yeah, and before you would always need to have almost a complete data product, you know, a data landscape of all the full model, all of the data defined before you start iterating, and that could take months, years before you're actually able to make that available to your end users. Really, the goal is to push that as close to the domain owners, to the people that really understand the data, build their own data products. They may, in fact, be in some really large organizations, they may have very different ways and methodologies of building their data products, because maybe they come from different organizations that were brought together through a merger or something like that. And at the end of the day, what's really important is just that they're able to define what it is, the product that they're building, have agreement on the governance of those products, make it available quickly, and be able to iterate and make changes, you know, even to the data model, and that other teams can make use of that data quickly, even possibly build other data products from combinations of data products.
I can chime in with a couple of sort of specific customer examples, if that's helpful. So kind of specific companies that, you know, we were fortunate to work with and that are sort of implementing, you know, parts of this or thinking about the data mesh. As an example would be Pepsi, PepsiCo, JetBlue, as well as Fox. So I'll talk about Fox for a minute. I think it's an interesting use case. They're actually very early adopters of technology, have a very strong data team. They're actually one of the earliest adopters of Redshift. And, you know, they sort of kind of cover super important events that everyone here is likely familiar with, like the Super Bowl, and are actually incredibly data-driven in how they collect and sort of cover these events. So you think about, for each event, they actually have sort of the number of users, for every user, the time spent on content, the number of devices that they have, really sort of, you know, highly specific data about every single user. And, you know, millions of users worldwide attend events like the Super Bowl, for example. So they receive data, their data platform team receives data from over 200 sources multiple times a day. They actually process sort of tens of billions of records per week. And they have a very sort of data-driven culture. So their executives actually use Looker dashboards in their office to make real-time decisions. And you can imagine sort of the freshness of that data is critical. And sort of Alex, the VP of Data Services who we work with, really refers to their implementation of data mesh as sort of what he calls controlled freedom. And the idea is that data teams actually want to move faster. And, you know, they want to encourage innovation and better decision-making across the business, and really sort of a strong emphasis on self-serve, recognizing that when you have sort of hundreds of people using data, generating data, consuming data, you really want to allow for that autonomy and speed. However, you need to have some sort of centralized controls, if you will. So you need to ensure access and reliability and governance and monitoring. And when those elements are sort of under control and sort of well governed, then actually innovation and decision making can be faster and better. So I really like how sort of Alex is thinking about them. They're investing a lot in sort of what are those kind of centralized controls that we need to put in place to allow freedom for our teams across the board. Just in case helpful as a sort of a practical example of that in real life.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, it's
awesome.
not-
And I love the controlled freedom aspect. And I think I saw Paul writing a note over there of get Fox off Redshift. So I think we're already providing value to our panelists as well, too. So
Yeah, Barr, I think your time to value and that a well-governed data mesh should actually enable fast time to value and faster insight is really, really important. It's when you don't trust data, when you don't trust how your peers are working, that you end up in those data brawl scenarios where you have an insight that you should be able to make a business decision off of, but you can't, and you end up paralyzed, and that business opportunity, you miss that. And I think I love that part of your example with Fox, that you need to have the organization making those in the moment decisions based on that data so you can capture that value in real time. And I know that's something that Indeed has worked really hard on too, right, Gary?
That's right. I think I'm stumbling. Rephrase the question here, Jon.
Well, I was like, I know just from history that Indeed has worked incredibly hard on building these trusted data sources and making sure that the different parts of the organization are aligned between data producers and consumers, so that folks can get value quickly out of it, and you don't sit on an opportunity because you're arguing about infrastructure or trustworthiness of the data.
Yeah, that's been something really amazing. I joined Indeed about 18 months ago, and coming from Intuit, and I had a chance to look at this organization, understand how they use data, and you hear about Indeed being data driven, but they've been data driven for basically the entire life of their company, and so they've had to build a lot of tools to be data driven. One of the really fascinating sets of tools are these aggregated Imhotep indexes. So basically, what we'd call a product team, often in addition to building the product that's serving the end user, they are accountable for building an index of their data, which they're the customer of, to measure the performance of their product. But also many other teams at Indeed might tap into that. And I think that's that's very much an essence of a data product, where I'm not just seeing my value to the organization as maybe a user website or a piece of the user experience, but the data I emit is actually a value of its own. And I need to think about it like a product manager. What features does it need? How does it perform? What are the contracts? What are the SLOs? And so, I think Indeed has kind of organically gotten there. And then how do you kind of take that knowledge, that experience, and expand it across to other things, maybe data, Snowflake tables or other things. So the other thing I would add is I think a lot of companies out there have examples where they're dabbling in this, whether they realize it or not. They have data products. I know at Intuit, Clickstream was a data product, right? And they had a lot of these things. So I think people out there thinking, oh, we don't use data mesh, we don't use data products. You'd be surprised if you start looking. You have some things in your organization that look a lot like it.
yeah, although, and I think that's a good point too, right? Like, well, we all may aspire to that state of controlled freedom. I guess the next thing I would want to dig into a little bit is what are the indicators that either from a practitioner point of view or a data leader that are going to signal that they should evaluate moving to a data mesh, whether that's, hey, we've already got some of this going already, or this is something that our organization has pain points specifically that can be identified that are signposts that it's time for data mesh. And especially for those that are early on in this process, they're going to be looking to justify it, right? So what are the sorts of business pains that are likely to be visibly alleviated as you start moving to data mesh? Like, those are the kinds of things I think that folks who aren't already there, or don't already have their glass of Kool-Aid, whether they're drinking it or not, are definitely going to be looking for early days on a data mesh.
I think for us, what we're seeing, and curious to hear folks' opinions on this, but I think sort of the strongest litmus test is if your organization feels that it's actually really hard to find the right data. So Jon spoke before about sort of discovery of data. If it's really hard to actually trust the data is often wrong. And if ultimately you feel like your cycles as a team are actually slowing down because you can't really go from hypothesis to getting the right data to validating to actually taking action based on it, then those are sort of all signals from a business perspective that you might want to sort of change the structure of your team, which is ultimately a lot of what the data mesh is about. There's some kind of practical sort of rules of thumb that we've found over the years. The first is around sort of the quantity of data sources. So literally, like, how many data sources does your company have? What's your reliance on those? It's very different if it's one or two versus hundreds and sometimes thousands of data sources that folks use regularly, multiple times a day. I'd say that's one variable. The second is the size of your data team. So in aggregate, how many data analysts, data engineers, and data product managers if you have on your data team. It's very different if it's one or two people who can sort of tap on each other's shoulder and say, hey, is this data right? Hey, where should I get the data? Versus if it's tens, hundreds of people who actually have to work together and collaborate, it becomes a lot harder. The third is number of data domains. And this is a data mesh specific idea, but the idea is sort of how many different functional teams, like for example, it could be one data domain could be a marketing specific data domain, it could be finance specific, it could be sales specific. How many of those do you have that you're actually relying on? And also, how many data products does your company have? So often, companies might have sort of one or two, but have like in the plans for next year to literally have like tens and hundreds. Shopify is an example. Literally has sort of tens of data products that they're powering. The fourth is data engineering bottlenecks. So like how frequently is sort of data engineering team actually a bottleneck to the implementation of new products? So these are sort of some of the rules of thumb that sort of look to sort of score yourself on these. And if you're sort of there's a strong severity in them, then you might want to look to make a change and to think about data mesh concept.
I kind of have a question about that, Barr, because when I think about it, when I think about the question, like I would say, if you're in the data space, evaluate it now. Like you should learn about it because, like with anything, it's a toolbox, and there may be some aspects you want to adopt without adopting the whole data mesh. Maybe you only have one database, or you have a database and you have a data warehouse, and that complexity scale, some of those dimensions are really low. But I would encourage a lot of people, go ahead and start thinking about your data as a product. Go ahead and think about your data platform team a little bit more as an enabler than kind of a pipeline builder in between. So you've seen a lot of companies. I mean, is that transition disruptive? Would it be best if I was going to start a new company to try to emulate a data mesh from the start?
I totally agree with you with sort of taking the principle of data as a product from day one. If folks are fortunate to start from scratch a data team, by all means, that seems like the holy grail. If we could sort of start it anew and have a blank slate, totally agree with you. And by the way, folks who've actually like seen this movie in 2-3 companies, and in their fourth company, they're like, this time I'm getting it right. There's definitely folks who say that and want that. I think the reality is like data teams are overwhelmed with things to do. There's so many solutions out there. There's so many new things that they need to keep abreast of. Is it a data warehouse? And where are we moving to a data lake? Are we ETLing, reverse ETLing? There's so much for them. I definitely agree with you that thinking about data as a product should be from day one. So I, wholeheartedly agree with that. I do think that in practicality, you have to prioritize where you're kind of what sort of, what battles you're taking first. But I agree with you. There's little downside to actually starting thinking about that from day one.
Yeah, and we see a lot of customers that are migrating to the cloud. Right, they're taking their on-prem deployments, all those systems that have been built up over years, tens of years maybe, moving them to the cloud. And it's really just they really have to just start thinking about what's the best way to get them there quickly. Is it, if I start just doing lift and shift and just moving it as is that really going to be the best decision for me over time? Is that going to really make it easier to move new applications into the cloud or new data sets that maybe I didn't even have before? So it is, totally agree with Barr and Gary about that. The earlier you can get started on at least thinking about it, prioritizing it, making sure that people in the organization understand what data mesh is, what the concepts are behind it, the whys behind it, and start figuring out the right organization for it. That's just going to make all of the future moves and migrations much easier.
Excellent. Any closing thoughts, Jon, or weigh in on this one? I know we're running out of time here.
Yeah, I'll be quick here. Look, we are in a time where there's an embarrassment of riches in terms of tooling that we can select to help support this. It has never been easier to stand up a cloud data warehouse, like with what you can do with Snowflake, with the data cloud, to be able to build reliable pipelines to create data products. It is incredible. I think organizations need to think culturally about what they want to be. And then they can start making those moves, start thinking, like Gary says, about data as a product. Because, what's great about today, and even in that lift and shift move that Paul talks about, what's great about today is that you don't necessarily have to worry about your infrastructure falling over anymore. I mean, it works pretty darn well. And so we can start thinking about these higher order value things, like how do we become enablers for this data-driven culture that we want to build? How do we get to be more inclusive around this? How do we pick the right technologies for the culture we want? Because look, it's not going to be perfect for everybody or right for anybody at whatever phase of the journey that you're on. But it's never been easier to start thinking about these things and move them in the right direction in terms of making data more usable and getting value out of it. And what I love about the whole thing is that it's just created a much better discussion about what the value equation is and how do we measure ROI. I think that's really the whole thing about both data mesh and data as a product, is like, let's make sure we're getting a real return on investment, that we're capturing these opportunities that all this data represents as close to the opportunity as humanly possible.
Excellent. And now I think we've done it. We've reached the end of 30 minutes. So, summarizing data mesh in 30 minutes is a little bit like trying to express War and Peace as a tweet, I think. So definitely, if you are watching this and it resonated, I think, any of the companies listed here and probably the individuals themselves are more than happy to continue helping to educate the market on these concepts. And, that's what a lot of us do day in and day out. And I think we all have seen sort of the advantage that, the domain driven design around data and how that's starting to shift the speed to which you find value around data products, and sort of the resulting insights is important. So, please continue the conversation, whether it's in the chat at this summit or beyond. But I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to join us, and especially thank you to the panelists for lending us your time and your expertise. I know that your expertise is boundless, but your time is not. So we appreciate the value that you have assigned here. So again, appreciate everybody's time, and look forward to the rest of the summit.